The photograph arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 1876, slipped between the pages of a letter that had traveled 2,000 miles from a dying aunt in Philadelphia. And Eleanor Hartwell held it up to the sunlight streaming through her boarding house window with trembling fingers that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. The man in the image stood beside a weathered fence post somewhere in Montana Territory, his hat tilted back just enough to reveal eyes that seemed to look directly into her soul even through the sepia tones, and scrawled on the back in her aunt's shaky handwriting were the words that would change everything. Your father's ranch foreman, James McCallister, unmarried, good man, needs a wife. Will meet you in Silver Ridge if you come. Eleanor pressed the photograph to her chest and made a decision that would have scandalized every proper lady in Philadelphia society. But she had spent 23 years being proper, and it had gotten her nothing but a cramped room above a millinery shop and hands chapped raw from endless sewing. The journey west took 3 weeks by train and stagecoach, and Eleanor kept the photograph tucked in the pocket of her traveling dress, where she could feel its reassuring weight against her hip through every jarring mile. She studied it during station stops, memorizing the strong line of his jaw, the way his shoulders filled out his work shirt, the hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth as if he had been thinking of something pleasant just before the photographer captured the moment. The other passengers on the stage asked about it once, a matronly woman with kind eyes and too many questions, and Eleanor had simply said he was someone she was going to meet, which was true enough even if it left out the terrifying parts about crossing a continent to marry a man whose voice she had never heard. Silver Ridge announced itself with a cloud of dust, and the smell of horses long before the collection of wooden buildings came into view against the backdrop of mountains that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. She had seen pictures of the Western Territories in magazines, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer enormity of the landscape. The way the sky seemed to stretch on forever in shades of blue she had no names for. The stage driver helped her down with her single trunk and gestured toward the largest building on the main street, a 2-story structure with a painted sign declaring it the Silver Ridge Hotel and Saloon. Her legs wobbled after so many hours of being cramped in the coach, and she stood for a moment just breathing in air that tasted different from anything she had known in the crowded streets of Philadelphia. The hotel proprietor was a woman named Martha Donnelly, who looked Eleanor up and down with sharp eyes that missed nothing before softening into something almost maternal. You must be the Hartwell girl, she said, and it was not really a question. Your aunt sent word before she passed, God rest her soul. I am sorry for your loss, dear. She was a good woman, helped many folks when they first came through here years back. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes at this confirmation that Aunt Caroline was truly gone, the last link to her mother's family. But she blinked them back and thanked Mrs. Donnelly in a voice that only shook a little. The older woman showed her to a small room on the second floor that was clean and sparse, with a window overlooking the main street and the mountains beyond. James McCallister will be in town tomorrow, Mrs. Donnelly said, setting a basin of water on the washstand. He comes in every Friday for supplies. Ranch is about 10 miles northeast of here, good spread. Your father built it up from nothing before the fever took him and your mother back in '68. I reckon James has been running it well these past years, keeps to himself mostly, but folks respect him. He is a fair man, pays his debts, does not drink to excess or gamble away his wages. She paused, then added more gently, he knows you are coming if that is what you are worrying about. Your aunt wrote to him same as she wrote to you. He said he would be willing to meet you proper-like, see if you suit. Eleanor unpacked her few belongings with hands that would not quite steady, hanging her 2 good dresses in the narrow wardrobe and arranging her brushes and pins on the small table that served as both desk and vanity. The photograph she propped against the mirror where she could see it, and she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time just looking at it while the sun tracked across the floor and the sounds of Silver Ridge drifted up through her window. Men called to each other in voices roughened by wind and dust. Horses stamped and snorted at the hitching posts. Somewhere a hammer rang against an anvil in steady rhythm. This was her world now, these sounds and smells and this vast sky. And tomorrow she would meet the man who might become her husband if she could find the courage to speak to him without her voice failing entirely. Sleep came poorly that night despite her exhaustion, and Eleanor woke before dawn to watch the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose that made her chest ache with something she could not name. She dressed in her best day dress, a deep green cotton that brought out the amber in her eyes, and pinned her dark hair up in a style that was perhaps too elaborate for a frontier town, but made her feel armored against her nervousness. Breakfast in the hotel dining room was eggs and bacon and coffee so strong it made her eyes water, served by Mrs. Donnelly, who patted her shoulder and told her she looked lovely. Other guests glanced at her with the curiosity that strangers always attracted in small towns, but no one was rude enough to stare outright. The morning stretched out endlessly, while Eleanor tried to occupy herself with a book she had brought from Philadelphia. But the words refused to make sense, and she found herself reading the same page over and over without absorbing a single sentence. She moved to the window and watched the street, studying each rider who came into view, comparing them to the photograph that she had looked at so many times she could have drawn it from memory. None of them were him. A clock somewhere in the hotel chimed 10, then 11, and her stomach was twisted into such knots she could not have eaten if someone had offered her a feast. It was just past noon when Mrs. Donnelly knocked on her door and said in a voice pitched to carry calm, "He is here, dear." "Down in the parlor. Take your time, there is no rush." But Eleanor was already on her feet, smoothing her skirts with damp palms and checking her hair in the mirror one last time. The photograph stared back at her from its place against the glass, and she picked it up and slipped it into her pocket before she could think better of it. Then she walked down the stairs on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone in the hotel must be able to hear it. The parlor was a small room off the main lobby, furnished with chairs that had seen better days and a settee upholstered in faded burgundy fabric. The man standing by the window turned when she entered, and Eleanor stopped so abruptly she nearly tripped over her own feet because the photograph had not done him justice, had not captured the sheer presence of him or the way his eyes were not just brown but amber-flecked hazel that caught the light. He was taller than she had imagined, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped in the way of men who worked hard for their living. And when he pulled his hat from his head, she saw his hair was dark blonde streaked with sun lightning, slightly too long and curling at his collar. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and his voice was deeper than she had imagined, roughened by years of calling orders across open ranges and talking to horses more than people. "I am James McCallister. I am pleased to finally meet you." He did not move toward her, seemed to understand that she needed space to adjust to the reality of him, and Eleanor was grateful for that consideration even as she tried to find her voice. "Mr. McCallister," she managed, and was proud that she sounded almost normal. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I know it must seem strange, my coming all this way based on a letter and a photograph from my aunt." She reached into her pocket and drew out the image, held it up between them like a talisman. "This is all I had to go on, really. I hope I have not made a terrible mistake." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes and mouth that might have been amusement or might have been something warmer. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and took the photograph from her fingers, studying it with his head tilted slightly to one side. "I remember this," he said quietly. "Your aunt insisted on having it made when the traveling photographer came through last spring. Said she wanted to send it to you, though I did not understand why at the time. I thought I looked like a fool, standing there trying not to blink while he fussed with his equipment." He handed it back to her, and when their fingers brushed, Eleanor felt something electric race up her arm. "But if it brought you here, then I reckon it served its purpose." They sat then, Eleanor on the settee and James in one of the chairs pulled close enough for conversation but not so close as to be improper. Mrs. Donnelly brought tea that neither of them touched, and then left them alone with the door open just enough to satisfy propriety. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, and Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks under his steady gaze, but she did not look away. There was something in his eyes that made her think he was nervous too, though he hid it better behind a cowboy's weathered calm. "Your aunt wrote that you were a seamstress," James said finally, and Eleanor nodded. "I am, or I was. I worked in a millinery shop, did alterations and repairs mostly, though I made a few dresses for ladies who could afford custom work. It is not very exciting, I am afraid. Can you cook?" The question was blunt but not unkind, and Eleanor appreciated his directness even as she had to admit, "Not very well. I lived in a boarding house, took my meals there, but I can learn. I am not afraid of hard work, Mr. McCallister. I would not have come all this way if I was looking for an easy life." He nodded slowly, seeming to weigh her words. "The ranch is doing well enough," he said. "We run about 300 head of cattle, have good water and decent grazing land. The house your father built is solid, needs some fixing up, but it is comfortable enough. I have 2 men who work for me, good hands, they bunk in the cabin out back. It is not Philadelphia, Miss Hartwell. The winters are hard, we are 10 miles from town, and there are days when you will not see another woman for weeks at a time. I need to know you understand what you would be agreeing to." "I understand isolation," Eleanor said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I have been alone in a city of thousands. At least here the loneliness would be honest." She met his eyes and saw something flicker there, recognition perhaps, or respect. "I did not come west looking for comfort or society, Mr. McCallister. I came because I have spent my whole life being what other people expected me to be, and I am tired of it. Your photograph and my aunt's letter, they offered me something different. A chance to build a life that is mine, even if it means starting from nothing in a place I have never been." James was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor held her breath while he seemed to consider her words. Then he said, "The photograph did not do you justice either, Miss Hartwell. You are even lovelier in person than I expected." The compliment was so unexpected and so simply stated that Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but before she could formulate a response he was standing, setting his hat back on his head. "I have business in town that will take me a few hours. Would you do me the honor of having dinner with me tonight? There is a restaurant 2 doors down, nothing fancy but the food is good. We can talk more, get to know each other proper before we make any decisions that will affect both our futures." Eleanor agreed, because what else could she do, and watched from the parlor window as he strode down the street with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. Her hands were shaking, and she pressed them flat against her thighs, trying to calm the riot of emotions tumbling through her chest. He was not what she had expected. Better, somehow, more real and solid than the idealized figure she had built up in her imagination during the long journey west. But that made everything more frightening too, because it meant there was something genuine at stake here. Not just a convenient arrangement between strangers, but the possibility of something deeper. The afternoon passed in a blur of anxious preparation and second-guessing every decision. Eleanor changed her dress 3 times before settling on a deep blue silk that was her finest garment, probably far too fine for a frontier restaurant, but she wanted to look her best. She repinned her hair twice, and finally left it in a simpler style that felt more appropriate for Silver Ridge than the elaborate coiffure she had started with. When she came down to the lobby at 6 o'clock as arranged, James was already waiting, and the way his eyes widened slightly when he saw her made every moment of fretting worth it. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and offered his arm to escort her the short distance to the restaurant. Eleanor took it, and tried not to think about how solid the muscle was beneath the fabric of his jacket, how the simple touch sent warmth spreading through her whole body. The evening air was cooling rapidly now that the sun was lowering toward the mountains, and she was grateful for the shawl she had brought even though it was not quite cold enough yet to need it. The restaurant was indeed nothing fancy, just a room with a dozen tables and oil lamps that cast warm, golden light over simple wooden furniture. But the smells coming from the kitchen were wonderful, roasting meat and fresh bread, and something sweet that made Eleanor's mouth water. James guided her to a table by the window and held her chair with an old-fashioned courtesy that seemed natural to him rather than affected. A woman who might have been the proprietor's wife took their order and brought water in thick glasses that showed fingerprints in the lamplight. "Tell me about Philadelphia," James said once they were alone again, and Eleanor found herself talking about her life in the city, painting pictures with words of the narrow streets and brick buildings, the constant noise and crush of people, the way the seasons changed with less drama than they seemed to hear in the mountains. She told him about her work, the ladies who came into the shop with their demands and their gossip, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with her own hands, even when it would belong to someone else. He listened with an attention that felt rare and precious, asking questions that showed he genuinely wanted to understand the world she had come from. In turn, he told her about the ranch, about the rhythm of the seasons that governed everything from calving to roundup to the desperate scramble to get enough hay put up before the first snow. He talked about the land with a love that came through in every word, the way the grass turned silver in the moonlight and the mountains changed colors with the light, how you could see weather coming from miles away across the open plains. He spoke of her father with respect, calling him a visionary who had seen the potential in land that others had passed over. And Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes because she had been so young when her parents died that she barely remembered them. "He talked about you sometimes," James said quietly. "Before the fever took him, he and your mother both. They wanted to send for you, but you were being raised by your aunt in the city, and they thought you were better off there, getting proper schooling and such. He made me promise that if anything ever happened to them, I would look after the ranch until you were old enough to decide what you wanted to do with it. I have been keeping that promise for 8 years now." Eleanor stared at him, this information settling over her like a blanket. "The ranch is mine," she asked, and James nodded. "By rights, yes. Your aunt had the papers, I assume. I have been running it, taking enough to pay the hands and keep myself fed, but the profits go into an account at the bank here in Silver Ridge. It has grown to a fair sum over the years. I would have written to you about it sooner, but your aunt said you were young yet, and she would tell you when the time was right." He met her eyes across the table. "I reckon she thought the time was right when she knew she was dying. That photograph, her letter to you and to me both, it was her way of trying to ensure you had a future out here if you wanted it. She knew I needed a wife, knew the ranch needed a woman's hand, and knew you needed something different than what Philadelphia was offering you. The food came then, thick steaks and potatoes and greens cooked with bacon, and Eleanor was grateful for the interruption because she needed time to process everything James had just told her. She owned a ranch, had owned it for 8 years without knowing. This man had been faithfully managing it, building it up, waiting for her to claim her inheritance. The weight of it felt enormous, and she cut her meat with hands that trembled slightly despite her best efforts to appear calm. "I do not expect anything," James said after they had both eaten a few bites. "I want you to understand that. The ranch is yours, the decision about what to do with it is yours. If you want to sell it and go back east, I will help you arrange that. If you want to keep it but hire someone else to run it, I will step aside. And if you want to stay to marry and build a life here, then I would be honored to have you as my wife. But that choice has to be yours, Miss Hartwell. I will not have you feeling trapped or obligated." Eleanor set down her fork and looked at him, really looked at him in the warm lamplight that smoothed the weathered lines around his eyes and made him seem younger than his years, though she guessed he was perhaps 30 or close to it. "What do you want?" she asked. "Not what you think you should say or what is proper. "What do you actually want, Mr. McCallister?" For the first time since she had met him, he seemed uncertain, turning his water glass in his hands and studying it as if it held answers. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, almost rough with something that might have been longing. "I want someone to build a life with," he said. "I have spent the last 8 years working from sunup to sundown, falling into bed too tired to think, waking up to do it all over again. It is a good life. I am not complaining, but it is a half-life. I want someone to cook breakfast with in the morning and read to in the evening. I want to hear a woman's voice in my house and see her dresses hanging next to my shirts. I want children someday, if God wills it. I want to matter to someone, to be more than just the hired hand who runs the place." He looked up at her then, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her breath catch. "When your aunt sent me that letter saying you might be willing to come west, that you were alone and looking for something different, I let myself hope for the first time in years. And then you walked into that parlor today, and you were even more than I had dared to imagine, and I thought maybe, just maybe, we could make something good together." The restaurant seemed very quiet suddenly, or maybe Eleanor just could not hear anything over the pounding of her own heart. She reached across the table without thinking and laid her hand over his where it rested beside his plate. His skin was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who worked with rope and leather and wood, and when his fingers closed around hers, she felt something settle into place in her chest. "I think the real thing is even better than the photograph," she said softly, and watched his eyes widen slightly before a smile spread across his face that transformed him entirely, making him look younger and happier and almost unbearably handsome. "I came west with only that picture to guide me, Mr. McCallister, and I will not lie and say I am not frightened because I am terrified. But I am also more certain of this than I have been of anything in my life. I want to stay. I want to try to make something good together, if you are willing to be patient with me while I learn how to be a ranch wife. James," he said, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand that sent shivers up her arm. "If we are going to be married, you should call me James. And I will call you Eleanor if you will allow it." "I will allow it," she said, and felt a smile tug at her own lips despite the tears that were threatening to spill over. "Though I should warn you that I really am a terrible cook, and I have never been on a horse in my life, and I am probably going to make 100 mistakes before I figure out how to do this properly." "Then we will figure it out together," James said, and the simple certainty in his voice made Eleanor believe him. They finished their dinner talking about practical things, how long an engagement should be for propriety's sake, whether they should be married in Silver Ridge or if there was a minister who came around to the ranches, what she would need to buy in town before moving out to the ranch. But underneath all the practical planning was a current of something warmer, the knowledge that they had taken the first steps toward building a life together. James walked her back to the hotel as full darkness settled over Silver Ridge and the stars came out in impossible profusion overhead. Eleanor had never seen so many stars, had not known the sky could hold such vastness, and she stopped on the hotel steps to stare upward until her neck ached. James stood beside her in comfortable silence, and when she finally lowered her gaze, he was watching her with an expression that made heat pool low in her belly. "I will be back on Sunday," he said. "Mrs. Donnelly can help you with whatever you need until then. If you have questions or concerns, she knows how to reach me at the ranch." He hesitated, then reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. "Sleep well, Eleanor. And thank you for taking a chance on a cowboy you only knew from a photograph." "Thank you for being even better than the photograph promised," she replied, and then he was gone, striding off into the darkness toward wherever he had left his horse. Eleanor stood on the steps until Mrs. Donnelly called her inside, her hand pressed to where he had touched her face, her heart so full she thought it might burst. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of activity that left Eleanor little time to second-guess her decision. Mrs. Donnelly proved to be an invaluable resource, taking her around to the various shops in Silver Ridge and helping her assemble the basics she would need for ranch life. Sturdy dresses in practical fabrics replaced her city finery. Boots replaced her delicate shoes, a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the sun, gloves for rough work, and dozens of other items Eleanor had never thought she would need. The general store owner, a gruff man named Harrison, softened when Mrs. Donnelly explained the situation and gave Eleanor a fair price on everything, even throwing in a few extra items he said every ranch wife needed. "You are going to a good man," he said, as he wrapped her purchases in brown paper. "James McCallister is as honest as they come. He will treat you right, you mark my words." Eleanor thanked him and added the endorsement to the growing list of reassurances she was collecting like armor against her fears. Mrs. Donnelly also began teaching her the basics of cooking on a wood stove, patiently showing her how to gauge the heat and manage the dampers, how to make bread that would not turn out like rocks and stew that would not burn. "You will learn as you go," the older woman said, watching Eleanor's third attempt at biscuits emerge from the oven only slightly less disastrous than the first two. "James is not expecting perfection, dear. He is expecting a partner, someone to work alongside him. The rest will come with time." On Sunday morning, Eleanor woke with butterflies churning in her stomach and dressed in one of her new practical dresses, feeling strange in the sturdy fabric after years of more delicate garments. She braided her hair and pinned it up in a style that would stay out of her way during work, then packed her belongings into her trunk with hands that shook only a little. This was really happening. She was leaving the last vestiges of her old life behind and stepping into something entirely new. James arrived mid-morning driving a wagon hitched to two sturdy horses, and when Eleanor saw him her heart did a strange flip in her chest that had nothing to do with nerves, and everything to do with the way he smiled at her, like she was the best thing he had seen in days. He loaded her trunk into the back of the wagon with easy strength, then helped her up onto the seat beside him with hands that lingered at her waist perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Ready?" he asked, and Eleanor nodded even though ready seemed like an inadequate word for the tangle of emotions coursing through her. He clicked to the horses, and they moved off down Silver Ridge's Main Street at a steady walk, and Eleanor twisted in her seat to watch the town recede behind them until it was just a collection of buildings growing smaller against the vast landscape. The ride out to the ranch took nearly 3 hours, following a rutted track that wound through grasslands and crossed several shallow creeks. James kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks and explaining the boundaries of the ranch lands, telling her stories about memorable cattle drives and harsh winters, and the time a grizzly bear had wandered into the yard and terrorized everyone for 2 days before deciding to move on. Eleanor listened and asked questions and tried not to think about how alone they were out here, how far from any help if something went wrong. But as the miles passed, something in her began to relax. The landscape was beautiful in a way she had not expected, all rolling grass and distant mountains, with clouds casting moving shadows across the plains. Birds she did not recognize called from fence posts, and once a group of pronghorn antelope watched them pass from a respectful distance before bounding away. The air smelled clean and sharp, nothing like the coal smoke and horse manure of Philadelphia, and the silence was not oppressive but peaceful. "There," James said, pointing ahead, and Eleanor looked up to see buildings taking shape in the distance. The house was larger than she had expected, a 2-story structure with a wide porch wrapping around the front and one side. Nearby stood a big barn painted dark red, several corrals, a windmill turning lazily in the breeze, and a smaller cabin that must be where the ranch hands lived. Chickens scattered from their path as they rolled into the yard, and 2 dogs came bounding up to greet them with enthusiastic barking. James helped her down from the wagon, and the dogs immediately transferred their attention to Eleanor, sniffing her thoroughly before apparently deciding she was acceptable. "The brown one is Chief, and the black and white one is Scout," James said. "They are good dogs, will earn their keep keeping predators away from the stock and letting us know when anyone approaches." Two men emerged from the barn, both young and weathered in the way of cowboys, and James introduced them as Tom Bridger and Charlie Whitehorse. Tom was perhaps 25, sandy-haired and friendly, offering Eleanor a shy smile and a mumbled greeting. Charlie was younger, maybe 22 or 23, with the dark hair and features that spoke of his native heritage. And when he shook Eleanor's hand, his grip was firm and his eyes assessing but not unfriendly. "Boys, this is Eleanor Hartwell," James said, and there was something in his tone that made both men straighten slightly. "She will be my wife once we can arrange things proper. I expect you to treat her with respect and help her get settled in." Both men nodded and offered their congratulations, then made themselves scarce with the practiced ease of men who knew when to give their boss privacy. James carried her trunk inside and Eleanor followed, her heart climbing into her throat as she stepped over the threshold into what would be her home. The interior was dim after the brightness outside, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, she found herself in a large main room that served as both kitchen and living space. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. A cast iron stove sat near the back with a work table and shelves of dishes and supplies, and rough-hewn furniture filled the rest of the space. Everything was clean but Spartan, clearly the domain of men who did not much care about comfort beyond the basics. "I know it is not much," James said, and Eleanor heard uncertainty in his voice for the first time. "Like I said, it needs a woman's touch. But the bones are good, your father built solid. There are 3 bedrooms upstairs, though I have only been using one. The other 2 are yours to do with as you please. There is a root cellar out back for storage, smokehouse for meat, well water is good year-round." Eleanor walked slowly through the space, running her fingers over the table, examining the dishes on the shelves, peering into the stove. It was overwhelming and exciting and terrifying all at once. This was hers now, or would be. This was the space she would transform from a bachelor's rough dwelling into a home. "It is perfect," she said, and meant it, turning to find James watching her anxiously from near the door. "I can already see what it will become. It just needs life breathed into it." The relief on his face was almost comical, and Eleanor found herself crossing the room to him without conscious thought, reaching up to touch his cheek in a gesture that was perhaps too bold for their brief acquaintance, but felt right somehow. "Thank you for waiting for me," she said softly. "For keeping my inheritance safe and building it into something I can be proud of. For being patient enough to let me find my way here when the time was right." James caught her hand against his face, turning to press a kiss to her palm that sent electricity racing through her veins. "I would have waited twice as long," he said, his voice rough, and then he was kissing her properly, his other hand coming up to cup the back of her head as his mouth moved over hers with a hunger that stole her breath. Eleanor kissed him back with all the longing and hope and fear churning inside her, and when they finally broke apart she was trembling and he was breathing hard. "I should probably not have done that," James said, but he did not sound particularly sorry. "We are not married yet." "We will be soon," Eleanor said, and kissed him again because now that she knew what it felt like to kiss him she could not imagine going long without it. They set a date for 3 weeks later, which was as long as propriety demanded and as short as Eleanor's nerves could stand. The banns would be posted in Silver Ridge, and Mrs. Donnelly would help her make a proper wedding dress from fabric James brought back from his next trip to town. In the meantime, Eleanor threw herself into learning everything she needed to know about running a ranch household, and discovered she had a capacity for hard work she had not known she possessed. The first week was exhausting and humbling in equal measure. Eleanor burned more food than she cooked successfully, learning the temperamental stove through trial and error that left the kitchen full of smoke more than once. She gathered eggs from chickens that seemed personally offended by her presence and pecked at her hands with sharp beaks until she learned to approach them with more confidence. She tried to milk the cow and ended up with more milk on her dress than in the bucket until Charlie took pity on her and showed her the proper technique. She washed clothes in a tub with water she hauled from the well and hung them on a line to dry in the constant wind that never seemed to stop blowing across the plains. But she also learned the satisfaction of seeing James's face when she managed to produce a breakfast that was actually edible. Eggs cooked through, and bacon crisp and coffee that did not taste like mud. She learned the peace of early mornings when she would stand on the porch with her second cup of coffee and watch the sun paint the mountains gold. She learned the names of the horses in the barn and started to lose her fear of them, though she still had not attempted to ride one. She learned that Charlie had a gift with animals and a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard with its sharpness, while Tom was quiet but kind and never failed to offer to help when he saw her struggling with something. Most of all, she learned James. They fell into a rhythm during those weeks that felt both strange and natural, dancing around each other in the house as they learned each other's habits and preferences. He was an early riser, up before dawn to start the day's work, and Eleanor pushed herself to rise with him and have coffee ready when he came in from the first check of the stock. They ate breakfast together at the scarred wooden table, and he would tell her the plan for the day while she mentally organized her own tasks. He kissed her goodbye before heading out and kissed her hello when he came in for lunch, and each time Eleanor felt herself falling a little more in love with this quiet man who was so much more than the photograph had promised. In the evenings they would sit together after dinner, James teaching her to play simple card games or reading aloud from the few books he owned while she practiced her mending. Sometimes they just talked, sharing stories of their pasts, dreams for their future, fears and hopes, and all the small, intimate details that weave two lives together. He told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, how he had drifted north after his own parents died, working various spreads until he landed at the Hartwell Ranch and found a place that felt like home. She told him about the loneliness of the boarding house, the endless gray winters in Philadelphia, the growing certainty that if she did not do something drastic she would wake up at 50 and realize she had never really lived. "I am glad you were brave enough to come," James said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out. "I do not think I knew how lonely I was until you were here to fill the space." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him and the steady beat of his heart. "I think I was lonely my whole life until now," she admitted. "Even when I was surrounded by people, this feels different. It feels like belonging." The wedding day dawned clear and warm, one of those perfect September days when summer still lingers in the afternoon heat, but autumn whispers in the cool morning air. Eleanor dressed in the gown she and Mrs. Donnelly had labored over for hours, simple white muslin with lace at the collar and cuffs that she had sewn herself, her one nod to her former profession. Her hands were steadier than she had expected as she pinned up her hair and tucked a few wildflowers Tom had picked into the dark strands. The ceremony took place in Silver Ridge's small church, attended by what seemed like half the town, though there could not have been more than 50 people crammed into the pews. Mrs. Donnelly cried through the whole thing, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief while her husband patted her shoulder helplessly. The minister was a traveling preacher who made the circuit through the smaller settlements, and he performed the service with a gravity that made the words feel weighty and real. Eleanor looked at James as she repeated her vows, seeing her own emotions reflected in his eyes. Love, yes, though it was still new and growing, but also commitment and hope and determination to make this work, no matter what challenges they faced. When he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, when James kissed her in front of all those witnesses, Eleanor felt something fundamental shift in her chest. She was married. She was Eleanor McCallister now, rancher's wife, no longer the lonely seamstress from Philadelphia. The reception was held in the hotel dining room, transformed with white cloths on the tables and more wildflowers in mason jars. There was food and music, a fiddle player who coaxed lively tunes from his instrument while people danced and laughed and toasted the new couple's health. Eleanor danced with James, with Tom and Charlie, with Mr. Harrison from the general store, and half a dozen other men, whose names she struggled to remember. Her feet hurt, and her face ached from smiling, but she had never been happier, especially when James would catch her eye across the room, and his whole face would light up like she was the center of his universe. As evening drew on, they said their goodbyes and climbed into the wagon for the long ride back to the ranch. Tom and Charlie had gone ahead earlier, giving them privacy, and Eleanor sat close to James on the wagon seat with his arm around her waist and her head on his shoulder. The stars were coming out again, that impossible profusion of light scattered across the velvet darkness, and Eleanor thought about the photograph that had brought her here, the sepia image that had been her only guide into this new life. "What are you thinking?" James asked, his voice a low rumble she could feel through his chest where she pressed against him. "I am thinking how inadequate that photograph was," Eleanor said. "It could not capture your voice or the way you smell like leather and pine, or how gentle your hands are despite all the rough work they do. It could not show me how you look at me like I am something precious, or how patient you are when I burn dinner, or the way you check on me a dozen times a day like you cannot quite believe I am really here." "I cannot believe you are really here," James admitted. "I keep expecting to wake up and find it was all a dream, that you are still in Philadelphia and I am still alone at the ranch. And then you do something like kiss me good morning or laugh at one of Charlie's terrible jokes or just exist in my space, and I have to accept that this is real. You came west with only a photograph, Eleanor, and you changed everything. The real thing is even better," Eleanor whispered, echoing her words from that first dinner. "So much better than I imagined, James. I love you. I think I started falling in love with you before we even met, but now that I know you, I love you with my whole heart." He pulled the wagon to a stop right there in the middle of the dark road and turned to kiss her with an intensity that left her breathless and clinging to him. "I love you too," he said against her lips. "I have loved you since you walked into that parlor looking terrified and brave and so beautiful I could barely string two words together. I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of the courage it took for you to come here." They made love for the first time that night in James's bed that was now their bed, discovering each other with tenderness and passion and occasional awkward laughter when something did not work quite as planned. Eleanor had been nervous about this part, the physical intimacy that she had only the vaguest understanding of, but James was patient and gentle, and showed her that bodies could speak a language all their own. She fell asleep afterward wrapped in his arms, feeling safe and cherished, and like she had finally found the place she was meant to be. The seasons turned, and Eleanor settled into the rhythm of ranch life with a determination that surprised even herself. She became competent at all the tasks that had seemed impossible at first, learning to read the weather and the animals, to preserve food for winter and doctor minor injuries when the men came in scraped or bruised from their work. She learned to ride, tentatively at first on an old gentle mare named Daisy, but eventually with enough skill that she could accompany James on short rides around the property. Winter came hard and cold, snow piling up until the world outside was nothing but white, and the trips to town became impossible for weeks at a time. Eleanor discovered what James had meant about the isolation, days when she saw no one but her husband and the two ranch hands, when the wind howled around the house like a living thing, and the cold was so intense it hurt to breathe. But she also discovered the intimacy of those long dark months, Evenings spent close to the fire with James reading to her or teaching her to play chess. Mornings waking to frost patterns on the windows and the warmth of her husband's body beside her. Spring was a revelation, the snow melting to reveal grass already greening beneath and wildflowers beginning to push through the earth. The cattle moved up from the winter pastures where they had been sheltering, and Eleanor stood on the porch watching as James and the hands worked to check each animal and move them to better grazing. The baby came in late spring, arriving with less drama than Eleanor had feared after a labor that lasted through one long night and into the next day. James paced the house like a caged animal while Mrs. Donnelly attended Eleanor upstairs, and when the baby's first cry split the air, he took the stairs 3 at a time to burst into the room. Eleanor was exhausted and sweaty and probably looked terrible, but when she held out their son to James and saw tears track down his weathered cheeks, she felt more beautiful than she ever had in her finest Philadelphia dress. They named him Daniel, after her father, and he had James's hazel eyes and Eleanor's dark hair. James was utterly besotted, holding his son with a tenderness that made Eleanor's heart ache and talking to the baby in a soft voice she had never heard him use before. Tom and Charlie were equally taken, though they tried to hide it behind gruff cowboy exteriors, and Eleanor would often find one or the other of them making faces at Daniel or letting him grip their calloused fingers with his tiny hands. Life fell into a new rhythm then, one that revolved around the baby's needs and the endless cycle of ranch work. Eleanor was tired constantly those first months, up multiple times in the night to nurse and waking early to start breakfast for the men. But it was a good tired, the exhaustion of purpose rather than futility. She would sometimes think about the woman she had been in Philadelphia, lonely and longing for something she could not name, and marvel at how much had changed. Do you ever regret it? James asked one evening when Daniel was perhaps 6 months old. They were sitting on the porch in the cooling summer twilight, the baby asleep against Eleanor's shoulder and the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night around them. Coming all this way, giving up city life for this. Eleanor looked at her husband, this man she had known for less than 2 years, but who felt like he had always been part of her, and shook her head. "Not for a single moment," she said honestly. "Sometimes I miss little things, shops and theaters, and being able to see other women more often. But those are small things compared to what I have here. You, Daniel, this land, this life we are building together, these are real in a way nothing in Philadelphia ever was. I was just existing there. Here I am living." Years passed in the way they do, each one marked by the rhythms of the ranch and the growing of their family. Eleanor miscarried once, a sadness that took months to heal from, but then there was another baby, a daughter they named Caroline after Eleanor's aunt who had brought them together. She had James's smile and Eleanor's stubbornness, and kept her older brother on his toes from the moment she could crawl. 2 years later came another son, Thomas, named for Tom Bridger, who had become not just a ranch hand but a dear friend. The ranch prospered under James's careful management, growing from 300 head of cattle to over 600, adding horses for breeding, and even a small flock of sheep that Eleanor insisted on despite James's protests that he was a cattleman, not a shepherd. They built an addition onto the house, more bedrooms for their growing family and a proper parlor where Eleanor could entertain the other ranch wives who were slowly becoming her friends as more people settled in the territory. Charlie Whitehorse married a Crow woman named Morning Bird and built his own small house on the ranch land, becoming James's partner in all but name. Tom eventually moved on to manage a spread of his own further north, though he visited often and always timed his trips to coincide with Caroline's birthday because everyone could see he was sweet on her, even when she was still a child. Eleanor sometimes took out the photograph that had brought her west, now carefully preserved between the pages of the family Bible. The image had faded some over the years, the details less sharp than they had once been, but she could still remember the moment she first saw it, the leap of faith it had taken to travel across a continent to meet a stranger. She would look at it and then at James, now in his 40s and even more handsome to her eyes despite the silver threading through his hair and the deeper lines around his eyes, and marvel at how that small sepia image had been the beginning of everything. "The real thing is even better," James would say when he caught her looking, and pull her into his arms to prove his point with kisses that still made her heart race after all these years. Daniel grew into a capable young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, already talking about taking over when James was ready to slow down. Caroline was fierce and independent, more comfortable on a horse than in a drawing room, and Eleanor saw echoes of her own younger self in her daughter's restlessness and hunger for something beyond the expected. Thomas was the gentle one, more interested in books than cattle, and Eleanor encouraged his education with a fierceness that sometimes surprised James but made sense to her. She wanted her children to have choices, to be able to build lives that fulfilled them whether those lives were on the ranch or somewhere else entirely. On their 20th anniversary, James presented Eleanor with a gift that made her cry. It was a new photograph, this one of them together standing in front of the house with their 3 children arranged around them and the mountains rising in the background. They were older now, marked by 2 decades of hard work and Montana weather, but the love in their eyes as they looked at each other was unmistakable, even captured in sepia tones. "So when we are old and gray and can barely remember our own names, we will have this to remind us," James said, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they studied the image together. Proof that a scared girl and a lonely cowboy took a chance on a photograph and built something beautiful. "We built something extraordinary," Eleanor corrected, turning in his embrace to kiss him properly. "And I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Every difficult moment, every challenge, every long Montana winter, all of it was worth it to end up here with you." The years continued their march, bringing grandchildren and gray hair and the aches that came with aging bodies that had worked hard all their lives. Daniel married and brought his wife to the ranch, giving Eleanor the daughter-in-law she had hoped for and grandchildren who filled the house with noise and laughter. Caroline did eventually marry Tom Bridger, who had waited for her with a patience that reminded Eleanor of James, and they built their own ranch just close enough for regular visits. Thomas went to college back east, became a teacher, but returned to Montana with a wife and children of his own because the land called him back no matter how far he wandered. James and Eleanor gradually stepped back from the day-to-day running of the ranch, turning over more and more responsibility to Daniel while they enjoyed the slower pace of their later years. They took to sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over mountains they had looked at together for decades, hands clasped and comfortable in the silence that came from knowing someone completely. "You remember that first dinner?" Eleanor asked one evening when they were both well into their 60s. "When you told me the photograph did not do me justice? I remember thinking you were going to bolt back to Philadelphia any minute," James said with a chuckle. "You looked like a startled deer, all big eyes and trembling hands." "But you were so brave, Eleanor. You sat there and talked to me like we were old friends and you were not terrified out of your mind." "I was terrified," Eleanor admitted, "but I was also more sure of you than I had been of anything in my life. There was something in your eyes, even in that first meeting, that told me I could trust you, that you would keep me safe and work beside me and love me for exactly who I was. The photograph showed me your face, but it was meeting you that showed me your heart." James lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture he had repeated thousands of times over their years together, but which still made Eleanor's breath catch. "Best thing that ever happened to me was your aunt sending that photograph," he said. "Second best thing was you being brave enough to come west and take a chance on a cowboy." They celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a couple of great-grandchildren. 4 generations gathered in the house that had grown and changed to accommodate them all. There was food and music and laughter, stories told and retold of the early days, toasts raised to Eleanor's courage and James's patience, and the love that had built something lasting. Eleanor looked around at the faces of her family, all these people who existed because she had dared to respond to a letter and travel across a continent to meet a stranger. She thought about the lonely girl she had been in Philadelphia, sowing other people's dreams while her own withered, and sent a silent thank you to Aunt Caroline, who had seen what she needed even from a deathbed thousands of miles away. As the party wound down and the guests gradually departed, Eleanor and James found themselves once again on their porch, sitting in the same chairs they had occupied for decades, and looking out over the same landscape that had become as familiar as their own faces. The photograph that had started everything was framed now and hanging in the parlor, a reminder of where they had begun. Beside it hung the anniversary portrait and dozens of other images, a visual timeline of their life together. "I am tired," James said eventually, and Eleanor heard something in his voice that made her turn to look at him. His face was drawn in a way that had nothing to do with the long day of celebration, and she felt a flutter of fear in her chest. "Should I call for Daniel?" she asked, already starting to rise, but James caught her hand and pulled her back down. "Not yet," he said. "Just sit with me a while longer. Look at this land we built our lives on, this home we filled with love and family. I want to remember this moment exactly as it is." So Eleanor sat and held her husband's hand and looked out over the ranch that had been her inheritance and her salvation. The sun was setting in shades of gold, and rose that never got old no matter how many times you saw them, and the evening star was just beginning to show in the darkening sky. James's breathing was steady beside her, his hand warm in hers, and Eleanor imprinted every detail on her memory because something told her these perfect moments were numbered now. James died peacefully in his sleep 3 nights later, simply did not wake from dreams Eleanor hoped were happy. She held his hand and cried until she had no tears left, surrounded by her children and grandchildren who grieved with her, but also celebrated a life well lived, and a love that had been extraordinary in its ordinary dailiness. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch with a view of the mountains he had loved, and Eleanor stood at the graveside thinking about the photograph that had brought her to him and all the years they had been granted together. She lived another 5 years, long enough to see her great-grandchildren grow and the ranch continue to prosper under Daniel's careful management. She spent her days puttering in the garden, reading to grandchildren, and sitting on the porch looking at the mountains and talking to James as if he were still beside her. Maybe he was, in the ways that mattered. When her own time came, Eleanor was ready. She had lived a full life, had loved and been loved in return, had built something lasting out of nothing more than hope and courage and a photograph. Her last conscious thought was of James waiting for her somewhere beyond the sunset, probably with that smile that had stolen her heart the first time she saw it in person rather than sepia tones. They buried her beside him on the hill, and someone had the presence of mind to tuck the original photograph into her casket. The image that had started everything now returned to its owner, for whatever journey came next. At the funeral, Daniel stood with his arm around his wife and told the gathered family and friends the story of how his parents had met. A scared girl from Philadelphia and a lonely cowboy who took a chance on a photograph and built a love that lasted a lifetime. "She came west with only a photograph of him," Daniel said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion. "And my father always said the real thing was even better. They proved that every day for 42 years, through hard times and good, through losses and celebrations. They showed all of us what it means to build a life with someone, to choose love every single day even when it is not easy. This ranch, this family, everything we have is built on the foundation of their courage and their love." The photograph still hangs in the ranch house parlor, now over 140 years old and faded to a ghost of its former self. But the story lives on, told and retold to each new generation. The story of Eleanor Hartwell, who was brave enough to cross a continent to meet a stranger, of James McCallister, who was patient enough to wait for her, of the love they built from nothing but hope and a sepia image. The ranch still operates, passed down through the generations, a living legacy to the truth that sometimes the real thing is infinitely better than any photograph could ever capture. The mountains still stand watch over the land, snow-capped and eternal, and the wind still blows across the Montana plains, carrying the whispers of all the lives lived and loved on that soil. And somewhere in the collective memory of the place, there is an echo of an evening long ago when a woman stood on a hotel porch looking up at impossible stars, and a man told her she was even more beautiful than her photograph, the beginning of something that would outlast them both and ripple forward through time in ways neither of them could have imagined when they first took that leap of faith together.